How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Ride Along. We have a great episode lined up with Mr. Jeremy Strickland. He is a former undergraduate from Vanderbilt University. He was a full-time strategy and operations lead at Google for 5 years. He received his master's in public policy from the Harvard JFK School, as well as an MBA from Northwestern. He's currently a chief of staff at Google, who I think just started fairly recently. He's got a lot of really interesting insight to share us about business and how it intersects with public policy. First off, thank you very much for being here and taking the time out of your day to join us.
Absolutely. So excited to be here. I heard about the great work you were doing in this podcast, and it was easy to say yes.
So yeah, awesome. Great stuff. First question, we always like to ask kind of in your own words, high level summary of, your career journey and how it started off when you were an 18-year-old high school student, choosing where you wanted to go to college, your major, and it's developed to now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can give you a little bit about my personal and my career arc. So I grew up in a little town called Noonan, Georgia. My family was very much what you would consider not blue collar to working class. So the expectation was when I hit 17, 18, that I graduate and get a job rather than go to college. I was really inspired by my brother, who was the first person to go to college in our basically immediate or extended family. And he really became kind of this role model that I looked up to. And so I wanted to follow in his footsteps rather than becoming more of a manual laborer and continue my education. I was lucky enough to do pretty well when I was in high school, and I attended Vanderbilt University on a full scholarship. For me, the decision to attend Vanderbilt was really quite easy. It was whatever school was going to give me the most money.
Right.
And so the schools that I applied to were the ones that traditionally had the best financial aid packages. Kind of by the grace of God, Vanderbilt just ended up being an amazing fit for me. Absolutely loved it. I learned so much academically, professionally, personally there, and just a huge advocate of the school to the day. Over my 4 years at Vanderbilt, what I wanted to do kind of changed from the time I stepped foot on campus to the time that I left. When I first stepped foot on campus, I thought I wanted to work more in like public policy sectors in DC, and then ultimately transition into a full-time attorney. I'm either working out of DC or my hometown of, or my big hometown of Atlanta, if you will, extended hometown. Did a couple of internships on the Hill for various basically government or quasi-government organizations. Didn't love the speed of the bureaucracy and just kind of the pace, all of the different layers and approvals that I had to go through there. So I decided rather than either going back and working in kind of the DC atmosphere in a more public sector oriented role, or going directly to law school to work in the private sector for a few years. And I made this decision right around my senior year. With that in mind, I got really interested in tech. So started reading a lot of like Wired articles, really getting fascinated about like the latest like software and hardware that was being released. Through kind of a bit of fate, I ended up landing what it would be like an introductory sales position at Google. Kind of a funny story there, but the guy who interviewed me for the role at Google was actually a guy that I played baseball with on the Vanderbilt baseball team.
Oh, wow.
So I briefly played baseball my freshman year. He was wrapping up as a senior. I didn't know he had gone to Google after. I walked into the interview and it was kind of one of those, "What the hell are you doing here?" moments on both ends. So that was pretty cool. Overall, I think, that was just a funny story, but interviews went well. Spent the next 2 years in introductory sales role at Google. One of the things that I really learned in this role was basically how to identify and communicate with customers and stakeholders, to ask a lot of questions, to listen thoughtfully, and to really respond on their terms. After about 2 years in that role, decided to transition. I became a strategy and operations lead. I'd always kind of gravitated more towards the analytical and strategic side. Spent the next 3 years in this role. Absolutely loved it. Many people said I was a fool for leaving it, but went back and did my graduate school education, did my MBA at Kellogg. Kellogg's a really great collaborative learning environment, which is what I really wanted. In terms of placement, I knew I was either going to go to consulting or tech afterwards, and they're the best business school in the world, in my opinion, for those industries. I paired that with a Master of Public Policy degree at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. If you look at my resume, you may not see the public policy background because I traditionally keep it more private sector focused or oriented. When I was at Google, I did a bunch of cool things. So basically worked pretty hand in hand with the Special Olympics. Actually ended up being the Special Olympics Man of the Year one year for some of the work that I did with them. Basically, I founded, we never formally incorporated as a nonprofit, but I saw an opportunity. All of these tech firms within Silicon Valley, they have intramural sports leagues. And so all of the internal Google teams would play each other in basketball, football, whatever, ultimate frisbee, whatever else. Same thing would happen at Microsoft, LinkedIn, et cetera. I said, okay, why can't we all play each other? And then collect league fees and basically whatever we didn't use for refs or equipment, we donated to Special Olympics. So it's actually ended up being a pretty large commitment over 3 years, raising close to, I think, $65,000-$70,000.
That's awesome.
And the organization lived on even after I went to graduate school, which was really great. Just kind of wrapping up my career. After I completed my graduate school studies, I knew I wanted to focus on tech. That was really still my passion. I love the speed at which tech moves. I love the autonomy and the impact that you have. So I joined LinkedIn as a sales innovation manager. LinkedIn is a really great firm. I think it balances high performance with high integrity. Didn't love the role that I was in. So I started kind of passively looking. And then at that time, Google basically reached out to me and said, hey, we think we have a role that you could be a good fit for if you consider returning to Google. Checked in on it. It was a chief of staff role for the head of Google Shopping. Went through the interview process, seemed like a really good fit, and excited to be rejoining Google as of this week.
Right.
So good stuff.
So
that's basically it.
We're catching you right at the time for the next job. We'll have to get an update on how that goes as well, the new adjustment. So when you were, transitioning from looking at jobs in DC on Capitol Hill, was there a specific reason that led you to Google? Were there other tech companies that you were deciding in between and something about Google stuck out to you compared to those?
Man, that's a really great question. The first thing is I got to think it was just naivete, right? So my first cut of tech companies that I applied to was who recruited on campus, which is always kind of an easy first cut, right? Because you can easily just sign up through your career management center. Right. So I would encourage people to do that. Having said that, if I could go back and talk to, basically Jeremy the Junior at Vanderbilt, I would definitely tell me to be a bit more thoughtful. I was kind of one of those people that was caught at the intersection of do I want to go into consulting? Do I want to go into investment banking? Do I want to do tech? And I thought at the end, I was kind of leaning towards tech, but I did the traditional kind of consulting interviews, made it through some of those, ended up with a few offers. But really the Google offer appealed to me. And the reason why Google was so exciting to me, I think I just saw this rapid growth that it was on. So obviously everybody kind of knew about the company and the firm and some of the things that it had been working on in the past with monetizing search. But I really felt that there was a lot more, there was a lot of other areas that the company could grow into. And so even if I came in and started working on what was essentially their cash cow or legacy product, there were many other areas, or as we say in the tech world, tentacles that extend out that I could easily transition or pivot to. Having said that, the advice that I would give to people now when thinking about what tech companies to work for, and this is coming from someone who has both a master's in business and a master's in public policy. This is something I deeply think about. I use this term balancing high performance with high integrity. It's really something that I live my life by. So I want to give credit to one of my Harvard professors, John Haig, for really helping me to understand and kind of embed this term in everything that I do. And what I mean by that is high performance, right? So let's talk about what that means for a company. That's basically, top line, bottom line growth, right? So the company's growing in revenue at a healthy and steady rate. It's becoming more and more profitable. Maybe that doesn't matter to you as much. Some companies out there provide great jobs, but they aren't maybe profitable yet. Right. I know DoorDash just IPO'd and they're not, but that's a good firm. But I think that's not enough. I think that's one half of the equation. I think the other half of the equation is high integrity. And what I mean by that is a company that not only codifies its mission and its values, but lives those and embeds those in everything that they do. So at LinkedIn, I really felt like that was something that was really, truly important to the LinkedIn culture. And I
Mhm.
think if you talk to other people who worked at a LinkedIn, they would say absolutely that same thing, where this idea of openness and sharing and humility and humor even are things that you see every day.
Mhm.
And so that's something I also felt at Google as well. So I would encourage people to define what their own values are,
Mhm.
and then think about the companies, the high performing companies that share those similar values.
Mhm. In your case, as when you're getting started with your first sales job at Google, which is obviously a company, of over 100,000 people or close to over 100,000 people, did you feel like there was opportunities for you to express, your non-business related interests and stuff like that, and to still have that, company culture? And was it easy for an entry level employee to still find that?
Yeah, I mean, like absolutely. That's a really great question. So what was really interesting when I joined Google was, I come from what we would think of as a pretty traditional background.
Hmm.
So if you just kind of look at me on paper, I kind of check off all the boxes on what we would think of as the traditional white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? Like I
Right.
get I get every single one of those. I'm from a small town in Georgia. I grew up Baptist, right? Like,
Hmm.
I've enjoyed um, the benefits of white privilege to many
Right.
extent and things like that. Having said that, when I first started at Google, I was really entering into what was like a really progressive culture. And so there
Hmm.
was a bit of a culture shock.
Hmm.
I had spent 18 years of my life in Noonan, Georgia, followed by 4 years in Nashville, Tennessee. And then I was moving out to Mountain View, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Hmm.
And that caused a real fundamental reorientation of the way that I thought about things.
Hmm.
Some of the views that I held when I was a bit younger definitely evolved and have completely transitioned over that
Hmm.
time. These are not only basically political views, but also ethical and moral views as
Hmm.
well. So, I still consider myself a good Bible carrying Baptist, but at the same time, some of my views now differ from that of my parents,
Hmm.
who haven't had as much exposure to diverse experiences, to diverse people as I have.
Right.
With that in mind, to answer your direct question, did I always feel comfortable expressing myself at
Hmm.
Google? And maybe even some of my like political leanings or just areas of interest. I
Hmm.
mean that I think there were a few other people at Google who were
Hmm.
interested in going hunting on the weekend.
Right.
And that was something that was of interest to me. I think that there were few other people that I, at least on my immediate team, that I could identify with that would classify themselves as kind of a libertarian conservative, like I
Hmm.
do. Um, Now I would add a third adjective to that, which is a strange libertarian conservative. Um, and so, um, and so, with that in mind, I think I think I was entering a really progressive sphere. I think
Hmm.
Google tends to hire people like that, but I always felt warmed and felt a warm,
Hmm.
welcoming environment,
Hmm.
and that I would find people who would share similar interests and could basically express myself with them.
Right.
Having said that, like looking a bit more, like my wife works for a startup as well. She's an
Mm.
attorney, and I shouldn't say startup as well. She works for a startup. Google's a little past
Yeah,
startup
it's
stage.
kind of grown a little bit now.
Yeah, it's a little bigger. But she shares some of those similar kind of
Hmm.
feelings and leanings as I do, and she's found a company that really values that and its kind of
Hmm.
core mission. It's really so I can't. She's at a stealth startup, so I can't give a ton of detail. But they really value that kind of hands off, let people determine their own fate approach.
Right.
And so I think that that's really embedded in their culture. And so, again, I think it comes down to basically folks defining their own personal mission statement
Hmm.
and values, and looking for companies that align to those within a specific industry.
Hmm.
Because if you have a general idea of who you are, you can find companies that align with that.
Right. You talked about making the transition from sales to strategy and
Yeah.
operations leads. So what were the biggest day-to-day differences? And then, what motivated you to go and get your master's and stuff like that? Because you said a lot of people thought, you were crazy for leaving that job. What were,
Yeah.
your major reasons for wanting to go and get those master degrees?
Yeah, absolutely. So, truly, when you think about your career, you can think
Mhm.
about jumping off points, is a term that
Right.
my mentor likes to use, or inflection points. I think is the one that kind of resonates with me. There's a few kind of fundamental shifts or inflection points in my career. The first one was transitioning from basically a pure sales role,
Hmm.
so being the guy that's dialing for dollars, or basically just providing customer support to my book of business, to being somebody who's not doing that at all, who's setting strategy, running data analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, when I think about my career, right, we think about how we can maximize our learning curve or arc,
Mm-hmm.
right? So one of the skills that I was mastering in that sales role was essentially learning how to identify and communicate with people
Right.
on their terms,
Mm-hmm.
right? Those are skills that I brought to a strategy and operations role. But
Mm-hmm.
what I wasn't getting in a sales role was the ability to have, I felt like, can drive more transformative impact across a
Mm-hmm.
larger scale, and to use some of the skills that I had developed that I just felt a bit more passionately about.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't love, and I'll admit this, making the fifth or sixth call in a day saying, hey Bob, let's talk about your automotive business and see if Google AdWords or the display network or YouTube videos are a good fit for you.
Right.
Um, where I was at that point, kind of in my career, was like I was much more interested in spending a couple hours in Excel and
Mm-hmm.
seeing what the data tells me. So with that in mind, like I had to make this transition. What I did to prepare myself to garner those additional skills was I took night classes at Stanford
Mm-hmm.
to basically kind of shore up some basically fundamental marketing skills, finance skills, communication skills, and big data analysis.
Mm-hmm.
This required me learning technical skills such as SQL, modeling in Excel, things that at a traditional sales role you wouldn't pick up. And I did
Right.
all of this basically outside the traditional 9 to 5.
Mm-hmm.
I excelled in that role, the strategy and operations role, for the next 3 years. Again, I kind of had maxed out my learning curve. I was getting
Mm-hmm.
ready for a promotion to what we would think of as like an engagement manager, if we're using like the traditional McKinsey consulting term. So
Mm-hmm.
the person who's managing the other consultants or associates under them. And so I felt that I could and was ready to get promoted to that role, but I didn't feel
Mm-hmm.
that I was going to exceed or excel in that role because I lacked fundamental skills. I thought finance was a really weak point for me.
Mm-hmm.
I thought like during our FP&A meetings, during basically any other conversations, that I was not able to carry my own water there. And that was something that I really needed to invest in further. And kind of true to my sentiment there,
Mm-hmm.
I did my internship in investment, my MBA internship in investment banking at Goldman Sachs.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I ended up there was I, went on campus and I said, okay, what's the toughest finance internship to get? People said, you should go try to do that. And I said, all right, let's do it. And so that was set my goals and
Yeah.
on that. And that's what I did.
Uh-huh.
Did that, I thought about returning, but I really felt tech was a better fit for me.
Mm-hmm.
Having said that, going back to my main point here is why did I transition and go back and get the degrees? Look, I want to say it was all for my career and it was an investment in myself. Look, I spent 3 years doing the same role. I didn't feel
Right.
that I was about to get promoted. I didn't feel that I was in the best position to succeed when I got
Mm-hmm.
promoted. But I felt that it was going to be a little bit more, I was going to have a
Mm-hmm.
lot more learning and growth,
Right.
particularly in like the people management side, some hard and soft skill development. And so I felt like I could basically most expand that learning
Mm-hmm.
curve by going and getting a finishing degree.
Mm-hmm.
Additionally, it gave me the transition or the ability to transition to other fields if I wanted to, or to at least explore them.
Mm-hmm.
And I did explore them. I did explore going into consulting full time. I'm going to a different tech firm, going to what we think of as like a traditional Fortune 500 company,
Right.
and working in like an innovation unit.
Mm-hmm.
Looked at all of those different possibilities. But at the end of the day, I really felt like probably the best route for me was to go back to a big tech firm.
Mm-hmm.
Having said that, now I think I was doing that because I was a little bit intimidated by the amount of student loan debt that I had. And had I not had as much student loan debt,
Mm-hmm.
I probably would have looked a bit more like earlier growth stage startups,
Mm-hmm.
where it's not only me basically actualizing somebody else's policy or strategy,
Right.
but really being able to set it, which is something that I've done in the past, but it's always had sign off and approvals.
Mm-hmm.
And now in this role as chief of staff, I have the opportunity of saying just like, hey, I don't know, like, let's think about like kind of
Mm-hmm.
longer term implications here. Like, here's what I'm thinking, and really
Mm-hmm.
being able to shape and craft and mold that vision.
Mm-hmm. Was there a part of you that, thought that you just wanted the MBA, or did you know going into grad school you wanted to get your MBA and a master's in public policy?
Yeah, it's a really great idea. I knew around the 5 year or so mark that
Mm-hmm.
I thought the MBA was the right call.
Mm-hmm.
And my mentor really pushed me in that direction. Basically for this idea of the analogy that he liked to use is you have a toolkit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Inside
Right.
that toolkit, you have a screwdriver, a hammer, a saw, right?
Mm-hmm.
Over time, you're going to sharpen some and some are going to get duller. You're going to learn what are the tools that you can use on an everyday basis. At some point, you're going to realize that you have other things in the back of that toolbox that you've never even used before, like a level or a miter saw or something else, right? And that's really what the MBA does, is it helps you sharpen and polish the skills that you already have, so the tools that you already have, while helping you realize or figure out what are those unknown unknowns, right? What are the skills that I didn't know that I needed to have in order to be successful at that next level? And so he really pushed me towards getting the MBA. He was also a Kellogg graduate. Now I paired that with the Master of Public Policy, and that was a bit more for me. And so just to go into that like briefly, what that basically meant for me was I had always done work in kind of the public sphere, dating all the way back to my internships at Vanderbilt, some of the work that I had done outside of the office at Google, and then basically just an area of interest. For me, I felt that like an MBA just wasn't quite enough, right? Like, it's one thing to say like, hey, I have a master's in business administration. There's so many great and good business schools out there now. That I really wanted to say, I have this MBA, but the thing that makes me a little bit different or gives me that edge is I deeply understand state and local policy. So if we're thinking about how this is going to impact people at the state and local level, that's what I really care about as well. Like, how do we enter a new market or a new city, and we immediately kind of get things done and we get our product off the ground or we get moving. And so like for Google, that has larger implications in like GDPR, CCPA, a lot of privacy implications that kind of touch my desk. But yeah, so I'll say MPP was a bit more for me, but it was kind of a nice, like, I think my real true value add when comparing me relative to other MBAs.
And now, in your new role as chief of staff, I guess obviously, you're just really getting started, so maybe we don't necessarily have the total lay of the land, but how is your role going to be different than your other positions at Google? And, this is obviously a big leadership role. So what is that going to look different when interacting with younger employees and lower level employees?
It's going to be, it's super exciting. So I'm still super early in that career. I've had the opportunity, and I would encourage anybody that's looking at a new role to do this as well, which is talk to other people who are in similar roles. So I probably have had conversations with, 15 different people who were either in a chief of staff role or are currently a chief of staff, including a few at Google. One guy that I'll give a shout out to, his name's Easton Randall. He's a mentor of mine. He was one of my very first bosses when I was working for Congressman Lynn Westmoreland. He had been in the role of chief of staff a couple of times. And I just said, Easton, give me the rundown, man. Tell me everything that I need to know about being an effective chief of staff. And so like when I thought about basically making this move, he really helped me to understand that there are kind of three different types of chief of staff. And he kind of bases his logic and thought off Jim Baker, which for those of you who out there who may not know that name, Jim Baker was the chief of staff to President Reagan and then to H.W. Bush. And he has this really great quote that I kind of think of and a lot with my role, right? Which is, you can focus on the chief part of the title, or you can focus on the staff part of the title. The people who tend to do better focus on the staff part of the title. And so what does that really mean? Is, look, I'm not the one making decisions. My fundamental job is one purpose, which is to scale the efforts of my executive. So when I think about, if we're being very input driven here, one input that comes into me as like a middle manager usually equates to maybe one, maybe two units of output, right? It's one deck, one recommendation, etc. But one unit of input to an executive on which I can have input or be the gatekeeper that allows that input to ever get to her, that input that she has then becomes an output of 100 or more, right? Because her approach and touch is scaled across so many different organizations. Now, with that in mind, how is that similar or different to what I was doing before? Like, I think that there were three key skills that I learned when I was in the strategy and operations role before that have taken and will continue to use and rely on heavily in this new role. First and foremost, that's critical thinking, right? You have to understand when you're given a big pile of data and a lot of information and everybody says, hey, I need to speak with the executive now. What is the stuff that really matters? And how can you get to that as quickly as possible and peel away all the fluff that surrounds the true underlying initiative or motive. I think the second one is really understanding how to effectively communicate,
Mm-hmm.
whether that's through emotional appeals, whether that's through logic, or whether that's through your own credibility. So really, I'm somebody who buys into that idea of ethos, pathos, and logos.
Mm-hmm.
Really understanding which one of those three kind of mechanisms you can use to most effectively persuade or guide your stakeholder or other folks in the meeting with you or with whom you're working on a project.
Mm-hmm.
The last one that I will say is really being disciplined, right? That one of the things that I learned as a strategy and operations lead is there's so many big problems out there, but you really have to define your scope. And so one of the big kind of key moments in my career was as a strategy and operations lead. The frame of reference that I would have would be if I do input ABC, it'll lead me to outcome X. But now, as more of a chief of staff, it's really thinking about I want to achieve outcome X.
Mm-hmm.
How can I use inputs A, B, and C to get me there?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's this idea of what made me successful early in my career was being very input driven. Do the right things, you'll be in the right place, and things will go well.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's to being okay. You've proven that you can do that. If you have an end goal in mind, how can you basically figure out how can you achieve that goal by pulling on these different levers or drivers?
Right.
Right. And so I think that's it. And the final comment that I'll have there is one of the things that I'm still learning to do and still, I think, practicing, getting better at every day is identifying how to better work with other people, right? I think I work well with other people, but it's really understanding what are their preferences, how do they want to be communicated with, and how can I flex my style, whether it's making logical arguments, whether it's spending more time at the beginning of the meeting asking about their family and their kids, to really identify with them and communicate with them on their style or their plane, if you will.
Right. Well, would you say that there was like a pretty big difference in when you were, interviewing for that first role at Google, towards, your interview process now as you were going for chief of staff, and what were the biggest differences you saw in your own recruitment experience?
Yeah, that's a really great question, dude. I was so flippant, like kind of when I first started at that Google role. Like I didn't know, I was very much in the air of like what I wanted to do. I was basically a working class kid from Georgia who had somehow gotten into Vanderbilt. Like I had no idea that like a Google was going to even be interested in me.
Right.
And just to be invited to Mountain View to interview was just like a huge honor for me. And so for me, I did my work, did my due diligence, and apparently, I was good enough then to get in, and I enjoyed a successful career in that original role there. I was promoted ahead of many of my colleagues. Looking back on it, I don't know if I took it seriously enough.
Right.
Having said that, maybe that was the right thing for me because I am somebody, as you would imagine, somebody who's done these, high pressure strategic roles at Google, now in a chief of staff role, have done investment banking. I tend to be a type A, very anxious person. And so what I've learned is when I was interviewing for roles after graduate school, I would over prepare for it. And I'd be really anxious and that would sink me in an interview. I tend to be, so maybe by being not as type A and just being honored to be there,
Right.
I didn't go into that super anxious mode. Having said that, you got to do the work. You got to put in the work. And one of the big things that I deeply believe in, and is my biggest advice for candidates interviewing at these tech companies or really any company, learn the values of the firm, learn the mission and the values, and then literally repeat those words back to the person when you're telling your stories. So even if you're interviewing for a McKinsey, which I've done, I've had good graces to basically be advanced on several times there and had an offer. Just repeat back what their values are. Hey, I know that McKinsey really values entrepreneurship. Here's how I've been entrepreneurial in my life, right? Same thing for Google, Facebook, Amazon. My Amazon prep file when I was interviewing for that was 36 pages long, right? It was basically my behavioral stories, but told through the lens of Amazon's values, right? And that's how, I was able to go through that process and just kind of be lucky enough to have offer after offer, to the point to where I started turning down interviews at other places. And so I really encourage people to say that. Now, having said that, like this chief of staff role, look, like this was a completely different thing. Like I hadn't really planned on leaving LinkedIn. This was kind of, there was maybe like one or two, like not super happy, but I can deal with it. And then I was approached about this role, and this one I went like full blown, like, how can I learn everything that I need to know about Google Shopping? I did extensive like research on like who the stakeholders were. I remember like in my first interview, like over a 50-minute interview, I swear we did like 3 to 4 cases. They weren't like full like consulting cases, but they were basically like, if a consulting case has 4 parts, we probably got through like 2 or 3 parts on each one. And they were just rapid fire, like one after another. And it was just, you can't have a framework for every single one of those. So it's sometimes you just got to kind of think about it, right? Like, I remember one case was just like, it's the traditional difficult stakeholder case. How would you deal with this? Let's like walk through this together. Here's an example. What would you do next? And it was really just, kind of thinking about like, okay, like what really matters here? Like, what's their larger strategic vision? How can I like come into this situation and just ask a lot of questions to figure out, why isn't this going well? Or, what are the real constraints here? And then after that, only after diagnosis can I make a prescription.
Right.
And then only after that, before we make this huge recommendation, we got a pilot. We got to understand if it's going to work on a small scale before it goes to large scale. So this chief of staff role, I was really honored because I was speaking to another chief of staff at Google after I was offered the role. And she told me, she was just like, hey, I'm really excited to meet you, because I think she said 4 or 5 different people who interviewed for this role and they were rejected. And so like, these are good people that I know. And this lady went to HBS, so she's obviously very qualified. She's the chief of staff at Google as well. I mean, like, she's doing well. And she was just like, good high performers I know interviewed for this role and you were chosen. And, that really made me feel good. Really made me feel good that there was something else there that I could bring to the table.
Right. So, I don't want to take too much of your time, so I've got about 2 questions left, and this one I'll say is probably more of a personal interest and maybe in the overall career journey. But would you say that you're potentially interested in going back into public or public sector government affairs at any point in the long term, or do you really envision yourself sticking with what you're doing right now with Google for the long term and sticking in the private sector?
That's a great question. So the answer is yes to both, right? What I would hope is, as I grow in my career at Google and take on more and more responsibility, that eventually I will be able to infuse some of that public sector expertise that I do have, and basically bring in some of that public policy experience to have a bit more of a helping and defining hand in things such as GDPR policy or other areas. One of the things that I got really involved in when I was doing my MBA and Master Public Policy degrees was autonomous vehicle transportation. It's actually what I wrote my dissertation on, was AV regulatory policy. I would love to begin working with Alphabet's Waymo division to start to understand some of the challenges that they face at the state and local level, because that's really at this nexus or intersection of private and public sphere. And I think that's where someone like myself can truly add the most value, because I understand the challenges and equity arguments that we see from the public side. And then I also understand the need to make money and to be mission driven and to keep the cash flows coming in from the private sector side. So ultimately, that's where I hope my career will go. And I think that will be largely in the private sector for the next 25, 30 plus years. Ultimately, my goal is, while working in the private sector, bring more of that public sector practice in, continue to do public sector research on the side. So to this day, I continue to basically work with micromobility companies, autonomous vehicle companies. I'll do podcasts, speeches. I've done a few interviews. And those are really meaningful for me because they help me continue to learn and expand outside of my core role. With that in mind, I think the ultimate vision for me is, once I've kind of done and wrapped up in the private sector, is to run for office someday.
Oh, wow.
It's something that I've always wanted to do. I think public servant leadership is one of the most important things that you can do. And so in particular, I don't know where that's going to be yet, but I've always thought about it like my home state of Georgia.
Right.
My wife is from Michigan, and so that could be potentially really appealing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the things that I really bring that is a perspective of somebody who grew up kind of having to fight for every nickel and dime, and really being behind the technological curve in many aspects and regards.
Right.
Growing up in kind of ruralish Georgia, you're among the last people to get things like high-speed internet or good cell phones or even cell phone service or coverage and things like that. Like I talked to my wife about when she got some of those things versus when I got them. They were a decade apart.
Right.
And so I see areas, particularly rural areas, falling further and further behind some of these larger, more metropolitan areas from a technological perspective. And I feel really passionate about bridging that gap. So I think I'm the right person to do that because I've lived both lives and I truly kind of understand it. And I understand, from a technological perspective, you can't just lay pipe, right? That's not cost efficient, right? But I understand from basically a farmer perspective that if, we don't have some sort of internet or coverage, our stock that we manage through our SaaS provider now, that's all going to go down. Nobody's keeping that by hand anymore. So long way of saying, basically, someday I do hope to follow that public servant leadership model and run for office.
Yeah. What do you think is the timetable on, we talked about moving into Google and helping with their, government affairs and stuff like that. Is there a set schedule that people follow where they, do their time in other roles in Google, they rise up to the chief of staff level, and then there's a certain time when they're ready? Or is it more of a free flowing kind of as the need arises, you present yourself when you're ready? What do you think about that?
I think, look, I give this advice over and over to like new MBA graduates, to new undergraduates, like entering a role. Your first 6 months in your job is to kill the core. It's to understand the mission, to understand your day-to-day responsibilities, and then to, as quickly as you can, start exceeding those responsibilities.
Right.
For me in a sales role, that was things such as how can I basically overachieve my quota consistently over time? How can I make sure that my satisfaction levels with my clients, my customers, is exceeding the average bar for the team, right? Really understanding how I can be fundamentally great at that core role, right? You're still going to get better over time, but you really have that exponential learning curve before you plateau. That's the first 6 months. After that, that's when you can start to explore a few other areas. What are some other areas of interest in which I may want to work? And really, you want to take the next 6 months to think very strategically about that. For me, that's really in this current role, it's understanding, the chief of staff, like how I'm going to do this role, what type of chief of staff my executive wants, and I'm still learning. The next 6 months are really thinking, okay, I've really hit my stride here. How can I begin to make myself even better a little bit and expand outside of my core role? Then around that year mark, I think that's where you have the option to do two things. One, if the role is just not a good fit, that's a good kind of transition point. I don't think many firms, unless you sign a specific contract at like a consulting or an investment banking firm, that you're required to do the full 2 years. I know certainly at like tech firms, you definitely can, if it's just not a good fit, look to transition after a year, but generally not the best thing to do. Luckily, I left LinkedIn on good terms. I left after about 15 months. And they kind of understood that this opportunity that I was given was a little bit of a once in a lifetime opportunity, and I couldn't say no to it. I think the expectation is, at least for me and for other people, is that you do 2 full years in a role. After 2 full years in a role, you've usually mastered not only the specific core competencies, but you've also mastered what are those next level core competencies. And at that point, you're either ready for a promotion, which hopefully comes, or you're ready to explore something else. In between the 1 and 2 year mark, I do like this idea of extending yourself either through personal education or through a 20% project. And for those folks out there who are not familiar with the 20% project, that's basically just reaching out to another team at your own company or finding another provider that you're interested in and just saying like, hey, can I do some work for you for free? Right. So, probably a year from now, if we're having this conversation, I'll probably say like, hey, I reached out to the Waymo team and just ask if I could help with some of their regulatory policy issues that they were facing. Like I have 85 single space pages with a Harvard logo branded dissertation written on it. So I think I know what I'm talking about. And then, so I would encourage that, like find a 20% project. Unfortunately, big companies, LinkedIn, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, they're not going to be able to do that unless you're a full-time employee. So more and more often, I encourage people to do those with startups.
Right.
You can get that same skill, those same skills and experience with like a startup, doing a lot of that. So that's one way. The other way is like you can actually, start looking, and I would say you can get ready to transition around that 2 year mark. So, basically one of the other thing that I did, sorry to finish this point off, was, I realized in order to transition from sales to strategy and operations, I need to take a hard look at what I was good at and where my weak areas are. And that's why I chose to go back and do classes at Stanford. And so I would encourage, I think continuing education programs are a really great opportunity if done thoughtfully and well.
And so, our last question is kind of a tradition on here. And we ask, for you to look back through your career, and if you were giving advice to Jeremy at 18 or just to an 18-year-old who's interested in doing what you do, what would be that token line of advice from all the insight you've gained across your career thus far?
Somebody asked me this like a couple of weeks ago. I was talking at like an MBA panel thing. I think the first thing that I would tell them, I think there's kind of 3 points, right? So the first is like, don't do stupid stuff. And if you do, that's point one.
Right.
Like I'm talking like really, truly stupid stuff. Like I was a member of fraternity at Vanderbilt. Like, I'm a Baptist, but look, I drank on Fridays and Saturdays and had a darn good time doing it. And like, I'm not ashamed of that, but if you're going to do stupid stuff, just try not to hurt anybody else, first and foremost, or yourself. Second is stay the heck away from social media if you are going to do the first one, which is if you are thinking that something is dumb, limit your social media exposure. And that was something that I would encourage other people, because that lives on far after you, right? And so that's something that I've gradually started moving away from, and I've really tried to kind of purge as much as possible. And if you are going to do things that are, kind of social media, putting your names out there, make sure that they're thoughtful and things that you would be proud of having your name attached to years later. So that's like doing this interview here.
Right.
And then the third thing, that advice that I would give to Jeremy at 18 is, I guess it's really this whole idea of outwardly be humble, but inwardly be confident. And the reason why I think that that's really important for me is, or for 18-year-old Jeremy, is looking back on it, I've had the skills to succeed and do well in these different roles. But I think it was always, I would get too anxious or nervous. And maybe that was the self-doubt creep in, or that was the, hey, you're just a kid from a small town in Georgia. You don't deserve to be here. You're not one of these people. You didn't go to, Lawrenceville for high school or something like that. You didn't go to Harvard for undergraduate. You don't belong here. But look, there are people at every school who are just as capable, just as smart, and they just happened to not go to Lawrenceville, so they didn't get into Harvard. I think that that's one of the things that I would say. And when all else fails, just try to outwork other people.
Well, those are great lessons. Not being stupid, I think, too, is something that has been touched on in several interviews. So, thank you also once again for coming on. You had a lot of great insight. I know our listeners are going to really appreciate it. And to all the listeners out there, we're going to have more great stuff coming up. So just stay tuned. Thank you again, Jeremy.
Awesome. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. And feel free to reach out if you want to stay in touch.